Okay, so hi everybody. Now we're into week 8. We moved from the 1950s to this week we're into the 1960s. But the carryover is still dealing with communism, right? Because now we're going to investigate Vietnam. All right. And Vietnam is very different than any other war. See, last week we dealt with the Red Scare and McCarthyism and dealing with that, the communism being an internal threat to the country. Well, with Vietnam in the 1960s, that's the Red Scare's gone. But the threat of communism, or the threat of communism spreading in other places of the world, now becomes our focus. So what we have to look at this week is Vietnam and how very different that war was. Because we fight in Korea in 1950 to 1953, and we're supportive of that war. It's ends up a draw, if you will, a tie. But nonetheless, we were able to push the North Koreans back out of South Korea. But now in the 1960s, we're asked to get into Vietnam. Okay, and we actually got into Vietnam in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, advisors and things like that. And then when Kennedy gets elected, now we had a full-scale kind of U.S. involvement. We send troops, hot war kind of situation. So we ask you this week to create a timeline with some events from Vietnam, kind of walk us through a little bit what happened there in Vietnam. And the discussion is also about Vietnam, but the discussion asks us to look at why does the thinking about war change, right? Why is Vietnam different? Why don't we get the same, fervor or support for Vietnam that we had for other wars? Right? Vietnam's a very unpopular war. It's very much a war where there's a lot of pushback against the U.S. involvement. All right? A lot of campus protests, things like that. So you want to look at that and give it a thought a couple ways. Besides it being, a war outside the country, you got to think in terms of the 1960s. And your writing assignment, the paper this week, you have to pick an event from the 1960s and look at that and break that down. So what you want to do is look at what's going on in the 1960s. Right? Are the events and the way of thinking, the cultural change, the challenges to culture, does that have an impact on our thoughts as far as war in Vietnam? If we fought Vietnam in the 1950s, would have been different. Okay? So that's the way you want to look at it. Here we're into the 1960s, and we all heard a lot about the 60s and the things that went on in the 60s, and there was plenty of stuff. But what we want to look at is try to make that connection with all the cultural, social things going on in the 1960s. Did that now change our way of thinking about war, thinking about our commitment to democracy, and just our overall thought process about foreign policy? Okay, so that's what we got this week. The Vietnam timeline, we kind of set up our events all the way through. Okay, you got the discussion about Vietnam and thinking about why our thinking changed about war and that Vietnam War in particular. Because Vietnam started out with popular support. Keep that in mind. And then the last thing is we're still looking at the 1960s. You're going to pick an event and kind of break that down and talk a little bit about that in the paper. Okay? So that's really what we want to look at. All right? The 1960s Vietnam, and there's a changing going on, a change in thinking, a change in society. So what's that all about? Okay? So as always, never hesitate to contact me if I can help you in any way. All righty? Bye now.